After my wife passed away, my daughter took everything, my savings, my house, even my car, and kicked me out with just $52. I had to walk 3 miles through the night to reach my late mother's abandoned cabin deep in the mountains. Sitting there in the dark, I pulled out the compass she gave me before she died. She had said, "Keep this. You'll know when the time comes." I stared at it, feeling completely hopeless. Then suddenly realized, no matter which way I turned, the needle kept pointing to the same spot on the rotting wooden floor. So I pried the floorboard open and froze. Underneath it was a hidden steel door. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Your country, your city? I'd love to know. It means everything to see this community grow. A quick note. This story contains fictional elements crafted. My name is Raymond Calloway. I am 68 years old, a retired mechanical engineer. And if you want to understand how a man can lose everything he spent a lifetime building in less than 3 weeks, the story begins with a cup of coffee that went cold. I woke at 4:15 that Friday morning, the same as most mornings. The house was quiet in the particular way it gets before dawn, not empty, just still. I moved through the dark kitchen without turning on the lights, because I hadn't needed to for 44 years. I knew where everything was. I knew where she was. 2 cups. I always made 2. I carried the second one down the hall. Dorothy was in her reading chair by the window. The lamp was on. She'd turned it on before I woke, the way she had most mornings since chemotherapy made sleeping through the night difficult. Her book was open on her lap. She was wearing the blue cardigan I'd given her 3 Christmases ago, the one she said was too large and wore anyway. I set the cup on the side table. I looked at her. Her chest wasn't moving. I stood there for a moment that had no real length to it, both very long and over immediately. Then I walked to the kitchen, picked up the phone, and called 911. I gave our address clearly. I said I would leave the front door unlocked. I wasn't calm exactly, but my voice was. Sometimes the body keeps doing what it knows, while the rest of you hasn't caught up yet. I went back, sat down on the floor beside her chair, and held her hand until the paramedics arrived. That was March 7th, 2024. Dorothy and I had met in 1980, both working at the same engineering firm in Columbus. She was accounts receivable. I was mechanical. She corrected an error on one of my project reports and left a note that said simply, "I fixed it. You're welcome." I found her 3 days later to say thank you. We were married 14 months after that. 44 years. 2 houses, 1 daughter, a retirement we'd been planning together longer than I want to admit. Dorothy had a list of photography courses. I had a workbench I'd been sketching for a decade. We had a route mapped out, no planes, just the truck and the open road, and nowhere urgent to be. Pancreatic cancer doesn't negotiate. It had been 22 months since the diagnosis, and in those months, the photography courses and the road trips had become things we kept mentioning without scheduling. There's a kind of grief that begins before the loss I'd been living with, that for nearly 2 years. What arrived that Friday morning was something else. Heavier and strangely quieter. My mother Eleanor had passed 8 months before Dorothy, 91 years old, gone the way she'd lived on her own terms and without much noise. Dorothy had been the one standing beside me at the graveside in West Virginia, in the rain, holding my arm and saying nothing, because she understood there was nothing useful to say. She just stayed. I thought about that sitting on the floor next to her chair, listening to the ambulance outside. Sandra arrived 3 days later with her husband, Mitchell. My daughter is 44. She's a real estate attorney in Cleveland, precise, efficient, the kind of person who enters a difficult situation and immediately organizes it into manageable pieces. Mitchell owns a construction business. Together they handled the calls, the arrangements, the neighbors who arrived with food. I sat in the living room and said the things people say in those rooms, and I was genuinely grateful they were there. On the 4th day, Sandra sat across from me at the kitchen table with a folder. "Dad," she said, setting it open between us. "I need you to sign a few things. It's a general power of attorney standard estate management. It lets Mitchell and me handle all the paperwork, so you don't have to deal with any of it right now. Just temporary, just for the estate process." I looked at the pages, 4 of them. The language on page 3 was small and dense with legal terms, and my mind was still running at half its usual capacity. I hadn't slept more than 9 hours in total since Friday. My hands still carried a faint tremor I hadn't been able to shake. Sandra placed a pen on the table in front of me. I signed. I want to be precise about this. I am not a careless man. 30 years of engineering taught me to read specifications, check tolerances, verify every document before approving it. The signature I put on those pages was not the signature of someone who doesn't pay attention. It was the signature of a man who was 4 days past finding his wife of 44 years still in her reading chair, and who trusted the person sitting across the table from him completely. That distinction would matter later. I've thought about it many times since. That night I went to bed in the room Dorothy and I had shared for 9 years. Her reading glasses were folded on the nightstand exactly where she always left them. I didn't touch them. I opened the drawer on my side. Inside was a brass compass, small, heavier than it looked, its surface smooth from decades of handling. Eleanor had pressed it into my hand 4 days before she died, in the hospital room after asking me to close the door. "So keep this," she had said. "You'll know when the time comes." I'd almost asked what she meant. By the time I thought to, her eyes had already closed. She passed 3 days later at 3 in the morning. I got the call at 3:47, too late to be there. 6 numbers were engraved on the back of the compass in handwriting, slightly uneven, pressed in carefully rather than quickly. I'd assumed they were a date, maybe an anniversary. During Dorothy's treatments, I hadn't given them more thought than that. I set the compass on Dorothy's nightstand beside her glasses and turned off the lamp. I didn't know yet what I'd just signed. I didn't know she had already known. That understanding would come much later in a room beneath the ground that I hadn't found yet. 3 weeks after we buried Dorothy, Sandra called a family meeting. She used those exact words, family meeting, the way a lawyer uses words, precisely and with purpose. They arrived at 9 in the morning, both dressed for a professional appointment. Sandra wore a blazer. Mitchell had on a pressed button-down. They placed folders on the dining table before they sat down. I noticed the folders before I noticed much else. There were 3 of them. I made coffee. Nobody asked for any. I made it anyway because I needed something to do with my hands. Before I tell you what Sandra laid out that morning, I need to explain something that had been happening for the 18 months before it. What she presented in that room didn't come from nowhere. It was the conclusion of a process, and I was the person who had made it possible, one signature at a time. Over those 18 months, while Dorothy was moving through chemotherapy, Sandra had come to me 4 separate times with paperwork. Each time she described it as routine estate planning, keeping documents current, protecting assets, standard procedure for a couple our age with a house and some retirement income. Each time I signed without reading carefully. I was splitting my days between driving Dorothy to treatment centers 40 minutes away, sitting in waiting rooms, and learning enough about her medication combinations to have an informed conversation with her oncologist. I had nothing left over for dense legal language and documents my own daughter brought me and explained as routine. I trusted her completely. That's the whole of it. What I didn't understand, Sandra had been constructing a legal structure 1 document at a time. The first document established a family living trust, a legitimate estate planning tool that holds assets and governs how they're managed. Nothing unusual about the instrument itself. Families use them routinely. The second transferred our house from joint ownership directly into that trust with Sandra and Mitchell named as co-trustees, meaning all decisions about trust assets required their approval. The third amended the trust to include our financial accounts. The fourth, the general power of attorney, I had signed 4 days after Dorothy died, gave Sandra direct authority to act on my behalf in any financial matter, without further approval from me. Each step had looked reasonable in isolation. Together, they were a complete transfer of control. By the day Dorothy passed, every significant asset we owned had been moved into that trust. My signature was on every page. Sandra opened the first folder and called it an estate review. She walked through each item like a closing checklist, measured pace-level tone. The house placed in the family living trust. 18 months earlier, Sandra and Mitchell as co-trustees. Handled. No action needed on my part. Our joint checking account, the only account Dorothy and I had ever maintained, because 4 decades of marriage had made separate finances feel unnecessary, transferred to the trust's operating account managed by Sandra. My pension from engineering was modest. 3 firms over 30 years, none long enough for a full benefit. Those payments had deposited directly into our joint account. Social Security deposited into the same account. Sandra hadn't needed to redirect either income source. She controlled the account where both of them landed. My small consulting practice, mechanical reviews, for a handful of firms after retirement, suspended on liability grounds during the estate process. The truck I'd owned for 11 years, Mitchell needed it for a job site in the near term. Temporary. I sat through all of it. I let her finish. Then I asked the only question I had left. What's left for me? Sandra checked her notes. The answer was ready, which told me she'd anticipated the question. She mentioned Eleanor's property in Harlan's Creek, West Virginia. A frame house, older construction, sitting on about 2 acres at the end of a county road. $18,500 in past due property taxes. Last assessed value below the outstanding liability. Essentially worthless. Dad, it's a debt, not an asset. I looked at the table for a moment. I'll take the house. Something shifted in Sandra's expression. Not much, she was too practiced for that, but enough. A brief pause before the response. If that's what you want. Mitchell hadn't contributed much to the meeting. He contributed less after that. When I spoke, he was looking at the table, and he kept looking at it. That evening after they left, I walked through each room of what I'd already begun calling Sandra's house. 9 years of living pressed into those walls. Dorothy's coat still on the hook by the front door. A stack of library books on the kitchen counter she hadn't finished. My old drafting table in the spare room, buried under project notes I hadn't touched since the diagnosis. I stood at that table for a while. I had spent 30 years understanding how mechanical systems fail. From the outside, a structure can appear undamaged long after internal stress has exceeded safe tolerance. The collapse looks sudden to anyone watching. It never actually is. It's the accumulation of every unaddressed load point, every document signed without independent review, every assumption made in place of verification. I was beginning to understand what kind of failure this was. 18 months of individual steps, each one reasonable in isolation. Each one part of a structure I had never seen drawn on a single page. I turned off the light and went to bed in a house where nothing belonged to me anymore. Not on paper, not according to anything I had signed. I went to sleep, thinking about a worn wooden house in the West Virginia mountains with $18,000 of back taxes. Every person in that room had written it off without a second thought. I fell asleep wondering if they were right. I stayed in Sandra's house for 2 more weeks. That's what I called it in my head, Sandra's house. The adjustment took about 6 hours. There's a particular quality to a place where you're no longer fully welcome, nothing dramatic, no locked doors or raised voices. Just the way conversation stops when you enter a room. The way a brochure for a retirement community appears on the kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning, positioned casually. The way things are positioned when someone wants you to notice them without them having to say anything directly. Mitchell asked me twice about my housing plans. He used those exact words, Housing plans, the kind of phrase that creates distance while sounding practical. I answered both times the same way I was still thinking it through. That was true, as far as it went. What I was actually doing was standing in each room of that house and taking inventory. Not of what I was losing, I'd already done that arithmetic in the dining room 3 weeks earlier. What I was doing now was more specific. I was figuring out what I could carry. Dorothy and I had combined our finances completely in the first year of marriage. One joint checking account, one set of bills, one household budget managed from a single ledger I updated every Sunday evening at the kitchen table. We never discussed it after the first year. It simply became the way things worked. The logic had always been sound. We were one household, one financial unit. Over 44 years, that logic had served us without a problem. The problem was that I had no separate account. No savings under my name alone. The only cash I had access to was what happened to be in my wallet. At the moment Sandra transferred our joint account into the trust $52 and a few coins. The last bill before that had gone to the hospital gift shop the week before. Dorothy dyed a small bouquet of dahlias in a paper sleeve because the room needed something that was alive. $52. I looked that number up against the Greyhound website on the library computer 1 block from Sandra's house. Columbus to Martinsburg, West Virginia, the nearest major stop to Harlan's Creek. The fare was $52. I stared at that for a long time. I don't have a word for what I felt looking at it. Not comfort, exactly. More like a confirmation I hadn't known I was waiting for. I called the Harlan's Creek County Assessor's office from the library's public phone. Past due property taxes on Eleanor's house, $18,500. The clerk said it without emotion, the way clerks deliver numbers they've delivered many times before. I thanked her and set down the receiver. $52. $18,000 of back taxes. A house I hadn't spent more than 4 or 5 days at a time in many years. By any reasonable measurement, what Sandra had told me was correct. It was a liability, not an asset. I went back to Sandra's house and started packing. I want to tell you something about my mother before I explain why I went. Eleanor Calloway, Eleanor May Weston, before she married my father, spent 91 years being careful about things that other people weren't careful about. She raised me in a frame house in Harlan's Creek on a bank teller's salary, and I never once felt we were lacking anything that mattered. She read constantly, kept a garden that was more productive than it had any right to be, and said less than she knew, which I came to understand only much later, was a deliberate practice, rather than a personality trait. 8 months before Dorothy died, Eleanor was admitted to a hospital in Charleston, kidney function declining. The kind of gradual failure that 91-year-old bodies sometimes present without alarm until it becomes an alarm. I drove down 4 times over 6 weeks. On the 5th visit, she was having one of her clear afternoons, the kind that come and go at that stage and feel like a gift when they arrive. She asked me to close the door. I did. She reached into the drawer of her hospital nightstand and took out the brass compass. I recognized it immediately. It had sat on a shelf in her house for as long as I could remember. A heavy thing with a worn face and a surface polished smooth from handling. She held it out. "Keep this," she said. "You'll know when the time comes." I almost asked what she meant. The question formed in my mind reached my throat and stopped there. Something in her expression made me feel it wasn't the right moment for questions. Her eyes were already starting to close by the time I closed my hand around it. She passed 3 days later at 3 in the morning. I received the call at 3:47. By the time I arrived, the room was still and tidy the way hospice staff leave a room. I was too late. I've thought about that timing many times since, and I've understood for a while now that she would not have wanted me rushing. She was 91 and had spent her whole life on her own schedule. At the burial in Harlan's Creek, I noticed a man I didn't recognize standing across the grave from me. Older, heavy-set, wearing a dark jacket with water on the shoulders. The rain was light, the kind that accumulates without you noticing until you're wet. He wasn't with any of the small group who had gathered. He didn't introduce himself to anyone, didn't speak to anyone. And when the burial was over, he walked back to a truck, parked at the edge of the cemetery road, and drove away. I noted him in the vague way you notice things at a funeral briefly, without analysis, and then not at all. I had not thought about him again until I was sitting on a Greyhound bus watching Appalachian ridgelines fill the window. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Packing one suitcase after 44 years of accumulation is an exercise in decision-making that has nothing to do with sentiment. You approach it the way you approach any engineering problem. Establish your constraints. First, then work within them. The constraint was one carry-on bag medium-sized, the one Dorothy had used for weekend trips. The contents were chosen for function: 6 days of clothing, a weatherproof jacket, work boots, my notebook and 2 pens, a cell phone with a cracked screen that still worked the compass in the outer pocket. Dorothy's wedding ring was in the front pocket of my shirt, near enough that I could feel it against my chest. My own ring I kept on my hand. I was not ready to change that. Sandra said I could come back for the rest later. I looked around the bedroom, the books, the engineering manuals, the wall of photographs, the drafting tools in the case by the desk, and I understood that I probably wouldn't. Not because of any prohibition, but because of something more fundamental. Some things belong to a version of your life that no longer exists, and carrying them into the next one doesn't bring that version back. It just makes you heavier. I left most of it. The morning I left, I told Sandra I was going to Harlan's Creek. I said it at the kitchen counter quietly, the way you announce a decision that's already made. She looked at me. I've tried to read that look since, and I still can't place it exactly. It wasn't the expression of someone who wanted to talk me out of it. It wasn't quite guilt, and though there might have been some edge of it, closer to the expression of someone watching a situation develop in a way they didn't expect, but find they can't object to directly. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "All right, Dad." I picked up the suitcase and walked out. The Greyhound station was 11 blocks from Sandra's house. I walked it. The suitcase had wheels, but the sidewalks were uneven in places, and I mostly carried it. It wasn't heavy. That surprised me a little, that a life could pack down to something you could carry 11 blocks without stopping to rest. On the bus, I took the window seat. The Ohio flatlands thinned as we drove east, and then the land started to fold itself into hills, and then the hills became something more serious. Appalachian ridgelines appearing and disappearing in the winter haze. I had grown up in that terrain. I had left it at 22 for college and come back less and less over the decades. Watching it rise up outside the window now felt like something I didn't have an exact name for. The compass was in my jacket pocket. I took it out once somewhere in the middle of Pennsylvania and held it flat on my palm. The needle settled and pointed. I watched it for a moment, then put it back. I hadn't been to Harlan's Creek since Eleanor's burial 8 months earlier. There had been a man there I didn't recognize, older, standing in the rain across the grave, not speaking to anyone. I had forgotten about him until now, with the mountains closing in around the bus. I wondered who he was. I wondered a good many things I didn't have answers to. The bus rolled on. The ridgelines kept rising. I pressed my shoulder against the cold glass and watched West Virginia come in from the dark. The bus let me off at a gas station on the edge of Harlan's Creek at 5:30. The sun was already behind the ridge, and the air carried the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. The particular combination that belongs to mountain towns in early spring when the cold is breaking but hasn't fully decided to leave. I went inside and asked the attendant, a young man with a high school jacket and a crossword puzzle folded on the counter, if he could point me toward Eleanor Calloway's place on County Road 7. He looked up. "You family." Her son. A pause. Not an uncomfortable one more, the kind that comes when someone is recalibrating what they expected. "Nobody's been out there since the burial," he said. "I know." He gave me the directions. County Road 7, head east. About 3 miles, maybe a little more. No turns. Can't miss the mailbox. Red flag, broken hinge. I thanked him and walked back to the road. 3 miles is not a long distance for a man who has always walked. I had never owned a gym membership in my life, but I had walked neighborhoods, job sites, the long corridors of hospital buildings over the past 2 years. My body knew how to cover ground. The suitcase had wheels. The road was not entirely flat. What made it different wasn't the distance. It was the light, which was dropping faster than I'd accounted for, and the absence of a sidewalk, and the way the road curved ahead of me into a dark that the bare tree line did nothing to soften. At 68, you learn which physical inconveniences are annoying and which ones you should pay attention to. I paid attention, stayed to the inside of the road's shoulder, and kept moving. I thought about Eleanor as I walked. She had lived on this road for more than 50 years. Every year I came to visit Christmas, usually. Sometimes a week in summer when Sandra was young, I had driven this same route and thought vaguely, and without much examination, that this was simply where she existed between my visits, that her life here was a kind of quiet holding pattern until I arrived. I understood now somewhere on that empty road with a suitcase and the last of the daylight, how provincial that assumption had been. She had a whole life on this road. I just wasn't in most of it. A truck slowed as it passed me, going the opposite direction. The driver, an older man with the window down despite the cold, looked at me for a moment. "Need a lift? I'm almost there." He drove on. I watched the taillights. For about 4 seconds I considered calling after him. Then I kept walking. The mailbox appeared 10 minutes later. Red flag, broken hinge, exactly as described. The driveway beyond it was 40 yards of gravel, mostly reclaimed by grass, and the house at the end of it stopped me in place. Worse than I remembered, much worse. At the burial 8 months earlier, I had registered the house as needing work, paint, fading gutters, questionable. What I was looking at now was something different in kind. This wasn't 8 months of neglect. The siding had been losing paint for years, down to bare gray wood in long, stripped sections along the south face. The left side of the front porch had dropped several inches at the corner, the platform tilting at an angle that would eventually take the railing with it. One window on the upper floor had no glass, just a dark square open to whatever weather came through. I stood at the end of the driveway for a full minute. An engineer looks at a structure and reads it the way other people read a face. I read this one. The bones were intact. The roof line was still level, the foundation hadn't shifted visibly from the front. The problems were surface and maintenance. Significant, but not fatal. I went inside. The air was stale and layered old wood settled dust, and underneath it something faint I couldn't immediately identify. Something that might have been lavender years ago. I used my phone as a flashlight and moved through each room slowly. The kitchen, Eleanor's blue and white patterned dishes still stacked behind the cabinet glass, the same set that had been there my whole life. The table where she had fed me breakfast every morning of every childhood visit. Her coat hooks by the back door empty now. The living room, her reading chair beside the window, positioned to catch the afternoon light from the yard. Through that window, even in the gathering dark, I could see the shape of the old oak tree at the back of the property, massive, spreading, the kind of tree that had been old when the house was built. The electrical panel, I flipped the main breaker. Nothing. I tried the kitchen faucet. Dry. Both consistent with what I'd expected. The service had probably been disconnected at some point, after Eleanor was admitted. No one paying the bills, no one in the house. I carried my suitcase to the basement stairs and went down. The habit is automatic after 30 years, when I arrive at any structure I haven't been in before I go to the foundation. It tells you more about a building's real condition than anything else. The basement floor was full plank wood, typical for Appalachian construction, from the 1930s, and it was dry, which was the first genuinely good sign I'd had since the driveway. I swept the flashlight across the floor. My eye caught it almost immediately, the way an engineer's eye catches things that don't match in the northeast corner. A section of 4 or 5 boards that didn't belong with the rest. Slightly lighter in color. Grain running at a marginally different angle. And when I crouched and looked closely, no nail heads. Not one. Every other board in that basement was fastened with nails I could see plainly under the light. This section had none. I pressed my knuckles against it. The sound that came back was hollow, deeper and more resonant than the solid thud of the rest of the floor. I stood up, noted it, and went back upstairs. On Eleanor's dresser, there was a small photograph in a plain frame, Eleanor young, standing in the backyard garden with a boy of about 8. Me, I realized after a moment. Both of us squinting into the sun, both of us laughing at something off to the left of the frame. I couldn't remember the day. I picked it up and studied it for a while, then set it back exactly where it had been. I found a quilt in the hall closet. I laid it over the bare mattress in Eleanor's room, lay down in my clothes, and pulled it over myself. The house settled around me, small sounds, the kind old wood makes when the temperature drops. Somewhere around midnight, one thought kept returning. My mother was a careful woman. Everything she did had a reason. She had held on to this house for 50 years, paid the taxes to keep it, left it standing exactly as it was. A woman like that does not install a section of floorboards with no nails by accident. I fell asleep thinking about that. The first morning in Harlan's Creek. I woke before dawn, lay still briefly, and took a methodical inventory of everything I had. It didn't take long. 1 suitcase. $30 in cash. A phone at 40% battery with no working charger. Dorothy's ring in my shirt pocket. The compass in my jacket. A house with no electricity, no running water, and a section of basement floor I had not yet resolved. I got up and went to work. An engineer's first instinct in any unfamiliar structure is assessment before action. I had done a partial survey the night before by phone flashlight. Now, in proper gray morning light, I completed it, roofline holding level, porch damage cosmetic on the right, and structural on the left, the upper window frame intact, despite missing its glass. The foundation block I had already confirmed was sound. The house had been allowed to decline, but not abandoned in the way that reaches the bones. The bones were there. I started at the top and worked down. The first 5 days established a routine. Mornings, sweeping clearing, carrying armfuls of mildewed bedding out to the back fence line to air. Afternoons, the bathroom walls, the kitchen shelving, the gutters I could reach from the porch roof without a proper ladder. I scrubbed mold from the bathroom tile with a brush from under the kitchen sink and a container of powder cleaner that had enough useful life left in it. I found a broken window latch in the spare bedroom and wedged it shut with folded cardboard from a cereal box in the pantry, not permanent. But the draft that had been moving through the upper floor at night went quiet after that. On the second day, I walked into town and back 6 miles total and spent $18 on food, dried beans, rice, canned tomatoes, coffee, a box of oatmeal. $4 on emergency candles. That left $8 in my wallet, and a clear working knowledge of how carefully I would need to manage it. Eleanor was everywhere I looked. Her handwriting on the labels of mason jars in the pantry closet, preserves dated in her precise, slanted script, her reading glasses folded in the kitchen drawer beside a stub of pencil and 3 rubber bands. A grocery list written on the back of an old envelope, milk, white vinegar stamps, birdseed. A copy of The Joy of Cooking, with margin notes, adjustments, substitutions, a star beside the cornbread recipe with the word double underlined twice. There was a half-finished letter on the back of a church bulletin, 2 lines in her hand, and then nothing, as if she'd set it down mid-thought and meant to return to it. I didn't know what she'd meant to say. I put it back exactly where I'd found it. I sat with those papers longer than I'd planned. The handwriting of someone who is gone carries a presence that photographs don't always manage. I recognized her script from birthday cards she'd sent when I was in college 40 years ago. It looked exactly the same. On the third day, I went back to the basement. Daytime light through the casement windows was better than my phone flashlight had offered 2 nights before. I went straight to the northeast corner and crouched over the section of boards I'd noted on arrival. 10 minutes of careful examination confirmed everything. A different wood species from the rest of the floor, close in color, but finer in grain, cut to fit the surrounding section, with precision at every seam. Not a repair or patch. No nails. Every other plank in that basement carried square-headed cut nails visible in each board. This section had nothing, no nail holes, no countersunk heads, no evidence of permanent fastening. I knocked with my knuckles. The resonance came back hollow and deep, distinctly unlike the solid return the rest of the floor produced. Someone built this to be removed. I said it to the empty room, which is sometimes the clearest way to confirm what you already know. I needed 2 things before I could go further: a pry bar and someone who understood construction well enough to tell me what I was dealing with before I started pulling boards. I made a note of it and went back upstairs. On the 6th morning, I walked to the mailbox. The envelope was inside, no stamp, no return address, no postage mark. Someone had placed it by hand. Inside, $500 in cash, a mix of 20s and 10s, and a small folded note. The handwriting was unsteady but clear, the script of older hands that still knew exactly what they were doing. Eleanor was a good woman. Welcome home. I stood at the end of the driveway for a while. In a town this size, people are aware. They knew Eleanor was gone, and they knew someone had arrived at the house. They had not introduced themselves, which I understood. Grief and privacy run together in small places. But they had not done nothing either. I found myself more affected than I expected, not primarily by the money, though that mattered, but by the simpler fact of being seen. For several weeks I had been operating as though I had become invisible. This envelope said otherwise. I didn't try to find who had left it. Half toward utilities, half held back. The nearest neighbor lived half a mile down the county road. I walked over and knocked. An older woman answered, measured, friendly in the way of people who live on quiet roads and answer unexpected knocks carefully. I explained who I was. She let me use her landline without discussion. The utility office confirmed reconnection for both electricity and water, a deposit plus service fees, $200 total. I scheduled it for the following morning. By late afternoon, the crew had been and gone. I threw the main breaker. The kitchen light came on. I stood there looking at it for a moment. That was longer than the situation required. Then I ran the tap. The water came out brown from standing pipes and ran that way for 15 minutes before it cleared. I held my hand under it until it was cold and clean. That evening, I cooked on Eleanor's gas burner beans, rice canned tomatoes, and ate at her kitchen table looking out toward the backyard. The old oak tree was visible in the fading light, its branches wide and dense against the sky. I rinsed my bowl in the sink and watched the water run clear. The house had electricity, water, and something in the basement that didn't behave like the rest of it. Tomorrow I was going into town. I needed a pry bar and someone who understood how things were built. It's 3 miles into town on a road with no sidewalk. I'd walked it twice before. I walked it again that morning with a clear purpose and $50 in my pocket. Patterson's Hardware occupied the ground floor of a 2-story brick building on the corner of Main and Depot. The kind of store that smells like machine oil and wood shavings and has been in the same location long enough that nobody remembers when it opened. A small brass bell rang above the door when I pushed it in. The woman at the counter, June, per the embroidered patch on her vest, was working a crossword puzzle in the margin of the morning paper pencil, moving without urgency. She looked up. "Help you find something. Pry bar, a solid one, not a light one." She came around the counter and led me to aisle 3. I selected a 30-inch steel bar with a forged flat end, the kind of tool built for serious work without flex. $22. We walked back to the register. She rang it through and went back to her crossword before I'd finished putting my change away, the pencil already moving again. The door opened behind me. The man who entered was perhaps 70, built in the way that comes from decades of physical labor that shapes the body rather than depletes it wide through the shoulders, carrying useful weight. Gray hair cut close. Boots that had been resoled at least once. He set a small hardware box on the counter with the automatic ease of someone who knew exactly where the counter was, then looked at the pry bar, and his eye stopped there. He examined it with the brief, practiced attention of a man who has spent a working life reading tools, what they're designed for, what they'll actually handle, whether the person holding them knows the difference. Then he looked at me. "I know you," he said. "I don't think we've met. 8 months ago. Eleanor Calloway's burial. You were standing across the grave from me in a gray coat." He didn't frame it as a question. It was a statement he was confirming for himself. "I worked Patterson Creek Mine with a man named Arthur who grew up 2 lots down from Eleanor's place. When she passed, I felt I should be there. I didn't introduce myself. It didn't seem like the right time." His name was Earl Hutchins. A brief silence held between us. 2 older men standing in a small hardware store with 8 months, and one woman between them, a woman they had each known in entirely different ways, in different parts of her life, and who had apparently connected them without either of them knowing it. Earl asked where I was staying. "Eleanor's house." "How long are you here?" "However long it takes." He accepted that answer without comment, the way someone does when they recognize it and don't need it explained further. His eyes dropped to the pry bar. "What are you opening?" I told him about the basement floor. The northeast corner section of boards, different wood, no nails, the hollow resonance when I knocked. Earl listened straight through without interrupting. His expression changed while I spoke, a particular shift I've seen in experienced people, when something aligns with knowledge they already carry. 22 years in underground mining, he said when I'd finished. False floors, concealed storage space, hidden passage construction. Those aren't unusual in older Appalachian building, especially from the 40s and 50s. People in these mountains had reasons for keeping things private, and they had the skill to do it well. He paused. Old construction in this region follows patterns I've seen 100 times in shaft work. You learn to read what was meant to be found and what wasn't, and the two aren't always obvious from the surface. A pry bar will get the boards up, but you need someone who can read what's underneath before you commit to anything. And if there's nothing under them, then you'll have confirmed it and move on. He said it plainly. "I'll come by in the morning. I'm not occupied with anything pressing." I paid for the pry bar. Earl collected his box. We walked out into the mid-April morning together. He had a truck at the curb, an older F250, the kind that exists to be used. He gestured at the passenger side. I got in. We drove the 3 miles to Eleanor's property in near silence. I looked out the window at the road I'd walked, watching the distances compress from inside the cab. I thought about the conversation in the store. A man I had never spoken to had just offered to drive out to a county road and spend his morning helping a stranger pull up basement boards, on the basis that he had worked a mine with someone who had lived near my mother. He had asked nothing about payment. He had asked nothing about what I expected to find. He had offered the way people offer things when they've already decided and don't need a longer discussion about it. I had a daughter who had spent 18 months preparing legal documents to take everything I had built with paperwork and planning and professional precision. I had a neighbor I'd met 20 minutes ago who had offered to spend his morning on my behalf with no terms whatsoever. I sat with that arithmetic in Earl's cab and didn't say anything about it, because there was nothing useful to say. The math was simple enough. Simple things sometimes take a while to absorb fully. He pulled to the end of my driveway and stopped. 6 o'clock work. 6 is fine. He reversed out, and drove back down the road without any further ceremony. I watched the truck until it reached the county road and turned. Inside, I set the pry bar at the top of the basement stairs placed for morning, the way you stage a tool before work begins. Then I saw the compass on the dresser. 6 numbers I hadn't decoded, a section of floor that didn't belong with the rest. A man I had watched standing in the rain at my mother's burial arriving in the morning with 22 years of experience below ground. I went to bed early. I wanted to be sharp. Earl Hutchins arrived at 6:48 in the morning, which I noted because I had been awake since 4 and had been watching the end of the driveway since 6:15. He came with a vacuum thermos of coffee and 2 cups, which told me he had thought this through more than a casual offer required. We stood on the porch and drank without much conversation. The morning was cold enough that the steam rose straight up from both cups before the air caught it. Earl looked at the oak tree in the backyard. It was large even from this distance, the kind of tree that had outlasted several generations of the people who had lived near it. "That's old growth," he said. "My mother tended it every summer when I was a boy. We used to grow tomatoes along the south side of it." He nodded once slowly and didn't say anything further. We finished the coffee. I took both cups inside, rinsed them, and set them on the counter. When I came back out, Earl was already at the front door waiting. We went down. The basement staircase was steep in the way of older construction, steeper than building codes would accept today, each tread narrow. Earl went first, testing each step before committing his weight. His flashlight was a serious piece of equipment, the kind used in professional inspection work, and when he switched it on at the bottom of the stairs, it changed the room entirely. Every corner came in clearly. The rough texture of the concrete block walls, the underside of the floor joists overhead, the full dimensions of the space, all of it visible in a way that my phone flashlight had never managed. Earl moved through the basement without speaking. He made a complete circuit of the room before he stopped anywhere, the way someone does when they are building a picture of a space, rather than reacting to the first detail that catches their eye. I watched him look, and I looked where he looked, which is the most useful thing you can do when you're working with someone who knows more than you do about a particular subject. When he reached the northeast corner, he set the flashlight on the floor and crouched down over the section of boards I'd marked in my memory days earlier. He ran his hand across the boards methodically, not tapping, yet just feeling. The surface, the seams, the edge where this section met the surrounding floor. "Different wood," he said. "Did you catch the color in daylight? And no nails," I said. "Not a single head anywhere in that section. That's intentional." He kept his eyes on the floor. "Someone cut these boards to fit this exact space without mechanical fastening. Friction fit each board held in place by the tension of the fit rather than hardware. It's not a technique you use by accident. That's skilled carpentry done for a specific purpose." He pressed his knuckle down and knocked twice. The sound that came back was hollow, deeper and more resonant than the solid return every other part of that floor produced, like knocking on a door that opened onto a larger room. "I've heard that before," Earl said. He straightened up slowly, using his knee without complaint, in the way of men who have spent decades on surfaces harder than this. "In old mine operations, hidden storage chambers beneath a work floor, you put a false panel in, and from above it looks like any other section of flooring. The space below stays invisible." He looked at the boards again. "Your mother put this here, or had it put here by someone who knew what they were doing. She moved into this house in 1958, I said. Earl absorbed that. Then she planned for this from early on. This wasn't an afterthought. We used the pry bar together. Earl directed the placement, the correct edge of the first board, the angle of entry, the amount of controlled pressure. The boards had been designed to be removed. That was the point of them. With the right approach, they lifted without resistance, one after another. The wood moving cleanly on a fit, that had been maintained by the closed space below and the weight of people not walking on it. First board, second, third. Each one set aside on the basement floor to the right, kept in order. Beneath the last board, a flat, smooth, dark gray surface. Not wood, not concrete foundation, steel. I crouched with the flashlight and looked at it properly. A steel hatch set into a steel frame that had been welded directly into the surrounding concrete of the foundation, not set on top of it, built into it. The frame was thick, the welds visible at the corners, and deep enough that they had clearly been done by someone who understood structural attachment. This was not improvised construction. Someone with professional equipment and professional knowledge had fabricated this and installed it when the foundation was accessible, which meant it had been here for a very long time. On the hatch's locking mechanism, a combination lock. 3 rotating dials, 2 digits on each dial, 6 digits total. Earl stepped back without being asked. He moved to the foot of the stairs and stood there with his flashlight pointed at the floor, giving me the space in the corner. I had not said anything about the compass to him. I had not said anything about the 6 numbers. I pulled the compass from my jacket pocket and stood over the hatch and looked at the numbers on the back, engraved by hand, slightly uneven, pressed in with care rather than speed. 8 months I had carried those numbers. Through Eleanor's death, through Dorothy's illness, through the last weeks in Ohio, through a Greyhound bus ride into the mountains. I had assumed they were a date, a memorial of some kind, something sentimental that I would understand eventually if I thought about it long enough. Standing above a steel hatch, 12 feet from the mattress where I'd been sleeping in a basement my mother had moved into in 1958 and maintained for 66 years, I finally understood exactly what they were. I reached for the first dial. I dialed the first number the way I used to calibrate instruments, slowly, with full attention, because precision is not something you approximate. The second. The third. Earl hadn't moved from his position at the foot of the stairs. The only sounds in the basement were the faint hum of the water pressure system running through the wall of the house above us, and the soft mechanical click of each dial finding its position. I was aware of my own breathing. I was aware of the weight of the compass in my jacket pocket, where I had returned it after reading the numbers off the back. The 4th number. The 5th. I held the 6th in place with my thumb and took one breath before I set it. The lock released with a single clean click. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the precise sound of a mechanism doing exactly what it was designed to do. I lifted the handle. The hatch was heavier than I expected, but it moved without resistance, swinging up and back on hinges that operated with a smoothness that had nothing to do with age. I stopped and looked at the hinges directly. No surface rust, no stiffness at the pivot. These had been lubricated not once when the hatch was installed, but maintained. Regularly, something that had not been opened in 50 years would not move like this. The hatch had been accessed recently. That was the first thing I understood. The air that rose from the opening was cool and dry, a breath of it reaching my face before the temperature equalized. No mildew, no staleness, no smell of a sealed space. What I caught instead was something cleaner, old metal, old paper, and underneath both of those, something faintly like cedar. The smell of preservation, done correctly over a long period of time. Earl offered to go first. I looked at him. This was my mother's. Whatever she left here, she left it for me. He stepped back without another word. I found the steel ladder mounted to the inner wall of the shaft, 10 rungs each one solid under my hands and boots. I counted them as I went down. At the bottom, my boots met a poured concrete floor that had been kept swept. 12 feet below the basement. 12 feet below the house my mother had lived in for 66 years, working in the yard above it, cooking in the kitchen directly overhead every year of that time, knowing this was here. I turned on the flashlight and swept it across the room. I stopped breathing for a moment. That was probably several seconds. The space was the full footprint of the basement above, larger than I had been prepared for. The walls were reinforced concrete block, the mortar lines clean and tight. The whole structure built with a competence that had nothing amateur about it. Whoever had constructed this had known exactly what they were doing. On the far wall, two pieces of mechanical equipment. One was a compact climate unit. Older in design, I recognized the style from the late 80s or early 90s, mounted to the wall with a dedicated electrical line running to a separate panel I hadn't noticed in the basement. Beside it, a small industrial dehumidifier, more recent in manufacture, positioned to cycle air across the lower portion of the room. Both were running. The soft operational sound of both machines was what I had been hearing from the bottom of the ladder without identifying it. Someone had maintained these units over time, replaced the dehumidifier at some point, with a newer model kept the climate unit serviced. This room had not been abandoned. It had been managed. The rest of the room shelving. Floor to ceiling on 3 walls, built from what looked like cherry wood, solid, well-joined, constructed with the same seriousness as everything else in this space. Hundreds of individual sections, each one holding objects of a specific kind. Black velvet boxes, each one sealed and sitting in its own fitted position. Flat acetate envelopes sealed and labeled. Every single item tagged in the same hand, Eleanor's handwriting. The same precise slanted script I had found on mason jar labels in the pantry upstairs, now applied to an inventory that covered 3 walls and stretched from my ankle to above my head. I moved to the nearest shelf and took down one of the velvet boxes. Inside, seated in a form-fitted insert, a coin small with the green-gold patina of old silver. The label in Eleanor's hand read, 1861 Confederate half-dollar specimen issue uncirculated. I set it back and took down one of the acetate envelopes. Inside a large format banknote, the paper aged to the color of cream, but uncreased and intact. 1862. Confederate States $100 error print serial a 00001. Earl had come down while I was reading. I heard him at the bottom of the ladder, but I did not turn around. He moved to the wall beside the stairwell and stayed there. I walked the length of the shelving slowly, reading the organization the way you read an engineering drawing, looking for the system underneath the surface. It was there, sorted by type, then by period, then by condition grade. Each label carried a date of acquisition, a provenance note, and a condition assessment in consistent terminology. This was not the collection of a casual enthusiast. This was the work of someone who had studied, developed a methodology, and applied it with the same discipline across decades. And the most recent labels I checked, several carried dates from 3 and 4 years ago. Eleanor had been coming down here until close to the end of her life, adding items, updating the catalog, maintaining what she had built. At the far end of the room, a work table. The surface was clean. A loop on a stand, a specialized LED lamp positioned for close examination, cotton handling gloves, folded in a neat stack. The tools of someone who knew how to handle what was on those shelves without damaging it. And in the center of the table, placed with the kind of deliberateness that makes it clear something was meant to be found, a thick envelope. My name written in blue ink on the front, in Eleanor's hand. Earl had turned off his flashlight. He was standing in the dark at the base of the ladder, giving me whatever privacy a concrete room 12 feet underground could hold. I lifted the envelope with both hands. In the lower right corner of the front, written in a smaller script below my name, a date. 14 months ago. My mother had written this letter 14 months ago, 1 year before Dorothy died, and she had known both things were coming. I broke the seal. Before I read you what my mother wrote in that letter, 7 pages, written 14 months before she died, by a woman who knew exactly what was coming, drop the number 7 in the comments right now. 7 pages. Just let me know you're still here, because what she wrote changed everything I thought I knew about the woman who raised me. And I don't want you to miss a single word of it. A quick note before we continue. Parts of this story include fictional elements built to explore real situations that happen in real families. If that's not what you came here for, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings. But if you're still with me, this is where it gets real. The letter was 7 pages, written 14 months ago, in the same blue pen my mother ordered by the dozen for as long as I can remember. The date confirmed what I already understood from the equipment running on the wall. She had been here recently. She knew what was coming, and she had prepared for it. Earl had climbed back up through the hatch, without being asked which was the right thing to do, and the kind of judgment that comes from reading a situation rather than waiting to be told. I heard his boots on the steel rungs, heard the hatch settle behind him, and then there was only the low mechanical hum of the climate unit and the sound of my own breathing. I sat down at the work table, set the pages flat in front of me, and began. Ray, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I owe you the truth about something I carried quietly for most of my adult life. The first thing I thought, reading that sentence, was that she had always written the way she spoke, directly, without decorative opening. The second thing I thought was that I hadn't heard her voice in 14 months, and I was now hearing it, clearly through ink on paper, in a concrete room 12 feet below her kitchen. I want to begin with something important. I maintained access to this room. The floor above was designed to be opened and replaced. I could come down here whenever I needed to. The last time I was in this room was approximately 8 months before I wrote this letter. I maintained it because what is here requires maintenance. I will explain more shortly. I set page 1 aside and continued. The second page was where she started with the Weston family. My parents held things from a different era. Coins and currency from before the Civil War, before the Federal Reserve, before standardized currency existed in this country. When they died, those things came to me. The pieces they held from the 1860s have now been held for over 160 years. Do you understand what that does to value? Scarcity premium compounds like interest rate, except the rate is driven by history, not markets. Every decade that passes without another specimen appearing makes what already exists worth more. A Confederate-era note in uncirculated condition was rare in 1910. It was rarer in 1950. By the time you are reading this, the number of people who will ever hold one is fixed and small and shrinking. I did not go out and purchase a $50 million collection. I inherited the seeds of one and kept them alive. I stopped reading and looked at the shelves, the labels, the system. 66 years of careful work in a room that no one else knew existed. She had inherited seeds and grown a forest quietly, one careful season at a time. The third page covered the bank. 32 years as head teller and then treasurer at Harlan's Creek Savings and Loan gave me something worth considerably more than a salary, expertise, and access. In the 1940s and 50s, people in this community paid debts in kind. Old coins, old currency they didn't understand and didn't value. I processed those transactions. I always knew when something carried value far beyond its face. Every acquisition I made through the bank was properly documented. I never took anything that wasn't offered to me. And I never paid less than what the person offering it understood it to be worth. The advantage was knowledge, not deception. Knowledge is a form of advantage. I used mine honestly. Page 4 explained why she had kept the room accessible. I never sealed this space permanently. The floor above was designed to look fixed, while functioning as a panel convincing to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, which was everyone. I came down here approximately twice a year for most of my adult life, to add items, to check preservation, to update the catalog. And in the last several years, to write this letter through a number of drafts. I wanted to get it right. The version you are holding is the 4th. The previous 3 are in the furnace. I wanted precision more than I wanted speed. I thought about that 4 drafts of a letter written to a son she expected would find it only after she was gone. She had taken the same care with this that she had taken with everything else in this room. Nothing approximate, nothing rushed. I lowered the pages and looked at the room around me. A woman I called every Sunday afternoon. A woman I visited at Christmas sometimes for a week in the summer when Sandra was young. A woman I had thought of without much examination, as content with a quiet life, a garden, her books, the small routines of a small town. I had driven past this house every visit for 40 years and gone back to Ohio thinking I understood what her life looked like. I had understood almost none of it. If you followed this story to here, what I'm about to read to you is what I sat alone with in a concrete room 12 feet underground. With one flashlight and pages my mother wrote 14 months ago, knowing both her own death and Dorothy's were coming. If this story has stayed with you, subscribe, because what she wrote on pages 5, 6, and 7 is what I have read every single morning since the day I found it. I turned to page 5. The handwriting hadn't changed, still that careful, even script she had maintained her entire life. But in the left margin, 3 small pencil marks, pressed lightly into the paper. She used to make marks like that in cookbook margins when a recipe was important. She had written and rewritten what came next. What she finally settled on explained the compass, the 6 numbers, and something else. Something she had done 3 months before she was hospitalized. Something I did not know about until much later. Page 5 of my mother's letter began with a paragraph she had marked with 3 small pencil lines in the left margin. She had written this section more than once. I could tell from the way the sentences sat on the page, too clean, too precise the smoothness of language that has been revised until nothing unnecessary remains. She had practiced this part. The compass, the mechanism is simple, but it required a skilled hand to install correctly. I asked a watchmaker in Charleston to place a small, permanent magnet inside the casing, oriented precisely and secured with epoxy. The magnet is strong enough to override Earth's magnetic field. The result: the compass needle no longer responds to magnetic north. It points in one fixed absolute direction, regardless of how you hold or rotate it. That direction is toward the back oak tree. You will notice that the needle does not rotate when you turn the housing. It stays locked in one direction relative to the ground, not relative to the compass itself. You will recognize this immediately. As a mechanical engineer, you will understand the mechanism faster than most people would. I stopped and looked at the compass in my jacket pocket. I had been carrying it for 8 months, trusting the needle the way you trust a tool that appears to be functioning correctly. It had appeared to function correctly because I had never thought to test it to rotate the housing while watching whether the needle followed or held. A basic verification, the kind I would have performed automatically on any other instrument. I kept reading. The compass gives you the bearing. This letter gives you the distance 18 steps from the back door, following that bearing exactly. 12 inches down. You will need something to dig with. I have left a small hand trowel in the potting shed along the east wall of the garden. Both pieces of information are necessary. The compass alone will not put you in the correct spot. The steps alone are useless without the bearing. I wanted you to need both. Page 6 was the trust. This property and everything on it is held in an irrevocable living trust established in 1978 and registered under Eleanor May Weston, my birth name, not my married name. I chose my birth name deliberately because I wanted this to be findable only by someone who was directed to find it. The county recorder's office holds only paper records. From that period, they have never been digitized. A search by property address or parcel number would show that the property exists and that a trust holds it, but the trust document itself requires a physical visit to the courthouse to locate. Anyone who searched online or who searched under the name Calloway would find nothing. The lawyer in Harlan's Creek has held the original trust documents for 40 years. His name and address are in the envelope with this letter. He is expecting you. I thought about Sandra, about the family meeting, About her looking at her notes and telling me the house was essentially worthless, a liability, not an asset. She was a real estate attorney. She would have looked. She would have searched. And she would have found nothing because she had searched online, probably under Eleanor's married name, and concluded within minutes that there was nothing of substance here. The assumption of a person who trusted their first look. The assumption I had spent 30 years training engineers not to make. Page 7 was brief. It was the last page. Eleanor had left more room at the bottom than the previous pages, more white space, like she had decided to stop rather than fill it. I knew Dorothy was sick. I knew what you were giving her in those last months, your full presence, your complete attention. That is the most valuable thing a person can give another person, and there is no version of it that is wrong or wasted. Don't carry guilt for it. I understood. I always understood. The time you gave Dorothy did not take anything from me. It told me everything I needed to know about who you are. With all the love I had and never said enough. Mom. I folded the letter along its original creases and held it in both hands for a while. When I climbed the ladder, Earl was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he had made himself from the supplies on the counter. He looked at me when I came through the basement door. He didn't ask anything. I went to the stove, poured coffee into 2 of Eleanor's cups, and carried them both outside. I set one in front of Earl on the porch railing and kept the other. We stood there without speaking. The afternoon had warmed enough that standing outside without a jacket was possible just. I took the compass from my pocket and held it flat on my palm. Then I rotated the housing slowly, 90 degrees, 180 all the way around. The needle didn't follow the housing. It stayed fixed, relative to the ground, pointing in one absolute direction, while the compass face rotated underneath it. A normal compass needle moves with the Earth's field. This one didn't move with anything. It was fixed. It had been fixed, deliberately oriented to a specific bearing before the epoxy cured, set permanently by someone who knew exactly what bearing they wanted. She fixed the needle, I said, to a permanent bearing. Earl looked at the compass. Where does it point? I looked up along the needle's direction, past the porch railing across the yard, to the old oak at the far end of the garden. I need to go out alone for a few minutes. Earl set down his cup. Take the trowel from the potting shed. East wall. He had understood more of this morning than I had told him. I didn't comment on that. I set my cup on the railing, picked up the trowel from the shed, where Eleanor had left it hanging on a nail, and went through the back door into the yard. I walked the bearing the compass indicated. From the back door threshold, I counted each step carefully, the way you measure anything you want to get right. 1, 2, the garden beds on either side. 10, 11, the grass getting longer, where Eleanor hadn't been here to tend it. 15, 16, and then 18. I stopped. The base of the oak was at chest height in front of me. The bark deeply furrowed the root system visible in ridges along the ground. I looked at the soil nearest the base. It had the slightly different texture of ground that had been turned within the past few years, compacted again by time and weather, but not original. If you weren't looking for it, you wouldn't know. I was looking for it. I put the trowel in at a low angle and worked carefully. 6 inches, 8 inches, 10. The trowel struck metal at 12. A small tin box painted dark green, with a folded piece of electrical tape along one edge securing a key that I only found when I turned the box over. Eleanor had put the key exactly where someone in a hurry would miss it, and someone paying attention would find it. I unlocked the box and opened it. Nestled in black velvet, a coin hand-struck slightly uneven at the edges, the way handwork always is. Heavier than its size suggested. Eleanor's label, written on a piece of cardstock folded beneath it, 1862. Bu V. Goldsmith's special final piece. one of 3 known specimens. Beneath the coin, a photograph. Black and white, slightly faded at the corners. Eleanor, in what looked like the 1950s, younger than I had ever known her, laughing in a way I recognized from 1 or 2 other photographs, a real laugh, rather than the composed expression she offered the camera on most occasions. Her hand rested on the shoulder of a boy of about 8 standing beside her, both of them squinting slightly into the sun. The oak tree directly behind them, smaller, then its trunk thinner, but recognizable, on the back in blue ink for you, Ray. The last piece. Mom. I sat down against the base of the tree, my back against the bark, one hand holding the photograph and the other holding the coin. The afternoon light came through the canopy, at a low angle, the kind of light that belongs to April in the mountains, when the leaves are just coming in and the sun still reaches the ground. For the first time since the morning I found Dorothy in her chair, I cried. Not from pain. From understanding, finally, completely what she had done, and why she had done it, and how long she had been doing it in silence. That evening, I told Earl the broad shape of it, not every number, not every detail, but enough for the picture to be complete. He listened without interrupting the way he had listened all day, which was the same way he had done everything without wasted motion. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Miss Eleanor drove the same car for 22 years, he said. Bought her shoes at the church thrift sale. In all the years I saw her around town, I thought she was just a modest woman. He paused. Turns out modest wasn't what she was. Careful was what she was. There's a difference. I had been thinking the same thing for the past several hours in different words. We sat on the porch until the temperature dropped enough to make it reasonable to go inside, and then we went inside. The lawyer's office was on 3rd Street, 2 blocks from the courthouse. The man who ran it now was the son of the attorney Eleanor had used for decades, a man in his early 60s, precise in the way of someone who had inherited both a practice and the habits required to maintain it. The files were organized in a system I could follow from across the room. He had a folder already set out on the desk when I arrived, which told me he had been expecting this visit for some time. The trust was irrevocable, established in 1978, registered under the name Eleanor May Weston. Ray Thomas Calloway, sole beneficiary. The lawyer walked through the provisions in the same measured way he probably walked through everything, not slowly, but without rushing, pausing in the right places to confirm I had absorbed what he'd said before continuing. When he finished, I asked the question I had been carrying since the family meeting in March. If my daughter is a real estate attorney, why couldn't she find this? He set his pen on the desk. Because this trust was filed in 1978 with this office and the county recorder. At that time, everything was on paper. The recorder's records from that era have never been digitized, not in this county. If someone searched property records online, they would see the parcel exists, that back taxes were owed, and that there was no recorded mortgage or lien. What they would not find is the trust document itself, because it isn't in any searchable database. It exists on paper in the courthouse, cross-referenced in a handwritten ledger from 1978. He picked the pen back up and turned it in his hand once. To find it, someone would need to walk into the courthouse and ask a clerk to search the paper files specifically for property transactions involving Eleanor May Weston, her birth name, not her married name. Anyone who searched for Eleanor Calloway would find nothing. Anyone who searched by parcel number or street address would see that the property exists, but would need the physical file to see who actually holds title. A quick online search doesn't reach that level of the record. I understood what that meant in practical terms. Sandra had looked online, seen back taxes, and no apparent ownership structure worth investigating, and concluded that the property was a straightforward liability. She was a real estate attorney. She knew how to search records. She had searched the records available to her and found nothing, because the record she needed existed in a courthouse drawer 60 miles from her office. written in a clerk's handwriting in 1978, 2 years before your daughter was even born. She had trusted her search. She had been wrong. That was the kind of mistake that a very competent person makes when they stop one step short of being thorough. The Harlan's Creek Public Library had 4 computers and a reference section that included unexpectedly 3 books on numismatics, the study and collection of currency and coins. I spent 4 hours there over 2 days. What I learned, Confederate-era currency in uncirculated condition carried values in the tens of thousands of dollars per note. Error prints notes with documented production flaws ranged into the hundreds of thousands. Specimen issues were rarer still, and the items the Weston family had held since the 1860s had been appreciating for 160 years, driven entirely by the fixed and shrinking supply of original material. Eleanor had understood this from the beginning. That was what the catalog system told me. She hadn't assembled the collection randomly, she had built it with the same deliberate methodology she had applied to everything else in that room. Earl knew someone who knew someone. 2 phone calls, 3 days. The appraiser's name was Garfield, a compact, careful man from Charleston who drove a clean sedan and brought a briefcase that contained more specialized equipment than I had expected. He wore reading glasses on a cord around his neck and put them on before he touched anything. He spent 90 minutes in the vault. He didn't say much while he worked. He moved through the shelving in the same systematic order Eleanor's catalog used, which I noticed and which I suspected meant he recognized a professional organization when he saw one. When he came back up, he stood at Eleanor's kitchen table and gave me the assessment without preamble. Whoever maintained this collection understood precisely what they had. The preservation is exceptional. I have consulted for museums with worse storage conditions than what's in that room. The catalog is professional-grade work, based on volume condition, and the categories represented particularly the Weston family Civil War material. You are looking at a collection valued between $35 and $50 million. The appreciation over 160 years on the original inherited pieces drives the majority of that figure. Your mother did not purchase this value. She protected it. He recommended selling in batches of 50 to 100 pieces. Private buyers first established collectors with documented acquisition histories. Done correctly, this is a decade of careful work. Rushing it costs money and creates vulnerability. I walked him to his car, shook his hand, watched him drive back toward the county road. Earl was on the porch. I sat down next to him and looked at the yard. The oak, the fence posts I'd set last week, the truck in the driveway. She drove the same car for 22 years, I said. Earl looked at the oak tree. Some people carry things quietly for a very long time, he said. That night I called the county to begin the process for the first sale. 10 to 12 weeks, they said. In the meantime, I had the house to work on, and a call to make to the Social Security Administration about 4 months of payments that had gone somewhere other than my pocket. 10 weeks is a long time to wait when you know what's coming. But I am an engineer by training and by disposition, and engineers understand that some processes cannot be accelerated without compromising the result. So I used the time. The first order of business was a bank account. I drove into town in a borrowed truck, Earl's, which he offered without being asked, and opened a personal checking account at Harlan's Creek Savings and Loan, the same institution Eleanor had worked at for 32 years, now under different ownership and a different sign above the door. The young man who processed my paperwork had no way of knowing any of that. I didn't mention it. I filled out the forms, received my account number, and thanked him. The call to Social Security came next from the library phone. I explained the situation to the agent, who answered 4 months of benefits deposited to an account that had since been closed and transferred without my knowledge, meaning 4 months of payments had gone somewhere I had not directed them. The agent confirmed what I had expected when a bank account is closed. Social Security payments that deposit to it are automatically returned to the agency. The money had bounced back. It was sitting with the SSA waiting for direction. She walked me through the process. I would need to complete Form SSA 1199 to establish a new direct deposit account and a separate non-receipt claim for the 4 months in question. Processing time for replacement payments 6 to 10 weeks from receipt of the completed forms. "It's not fast," she said, "but it will come through." I wrote down her name, the date, and the case reference number she gave me in the notebook I had started keeping for exactly this kind of information. I was an engineer. I documented things. The habit was 30 years old, and I saw no reason to abandon it now. The forms went out the following morning. I noted the mailing date. May and June belonged to the house. With the sale proceeds still weeks away, and the SSA replacement payment further out still, the budget for improvement was what remained of the anonymous envelope, $300 more or less, depending on what I found that could be salvaged or repurposed. I worked with what those constraints allowed. I scraped the south-facing siding down to bare wood and repainted using a mid-grade exterior paint in a color close enough to the original that the change read as a refresh rather than a replacement. 4 days of work, the kind that leaves paint in your hair regardless of how careful you are. I replaced 3 boards on the front face of the house where rot had reached the structural layer, cutting the lumber from a stack Eleanor had stored dry under a tarp behind the shed material she had apparently kept, with the same foresight she applied to everything else. The front porch railing went back level, secured properly, no longer something you tested before leaning on. Earl arrived on a Saturday with cedar planks milled from a tree that had come down along our shared property boundary the previous winter. He rebuilt the porch steps in an afternoon, not quickly, but correctly, each tread cut level, each riser uniform. The result was a staircase that felt solid underfoot, in a way the previous one hadn't for years. None of this cost much. Paint nails, wood screws, and time. When Sandra's rental car turned up my driveway on a late May morning, which I'll come back to the house, looked better than it had in years, and every improvement was explainable by labor and a modest materials budget. There was no financial anomaly. There was just a man who had spent 2 months working on a house he intended to live in. July arrived with the completion of the first sale. Garfield had spent the 10 weeks authenticating 60 selected pieces and placing them with 3 private buyers, established collectors, each one operating under a signed non-disclosure agreement before a single item changed hands. On the 14th of July, the wire confirmation came through $280,000, deposited to the account I had opened in May. I sat with that number for a few minutes. Then I drove to the county assessor's office. The cashier's check for $18,500, the full amount of back taxes on Eleanor's property, was the most deliberate check I have ever written. I handed it across the counter. The clerk printed a receipt, stamped it, and handed it back without looking up. I folded the receipt and put it in my breast pocket and drove back to the house. The F-150 came a week later, 10 years old, rust along the wheel, wells a crack in the dashboard on the passenger side. The engine ran cleanly and the frame was sound. $6,400 from a private seller on the county road 3 miles east. I inspected it the way I inspected everything from the underside up. Then I paid cash and drove it home. Everything went into the folder. Bank statements printed and dated, the wire transfer confirmation, the tax receipt from the assessor's office, the truck title, the SSA correspondence, including the envelope postmark, the notebook pages with case numbers and names. I bought the folder at the pharmacy for $2.49, and I kept that receipt too, paper-clipped to the inside cover. I had built turbines for 30 years. The difference between a turbine that holds and one that fails under load almost always comes down to documentation, knowing what went in, what was tested, what was changed, and when. I didn't yet know exactly how this record-keeping would matter. I knew that it would. By the end of July, the house looked occupied. Not finished, not restored to anything it hadn't been before, but lived in curtains on the windows, the porch solid, the yard cleared to the fence line. I stood on the new cedar steps with the second cup of morning coffee and looked at the driveway and the county road beyond it. 5 months since Ohio, this was the first morning I did not feel like a visitor in my own house. I was on that same porch on a late May morning, a few weeks before the sale closed, when I had watched a rental car turn off the county road and come up the drive. Sandra. I set down my coffee and waited. Sandra got out of the car the way she did everything efficiently without unnecessary movement. She was dressed for a city office wool blazer heels that hadn't been designed for gravel driveways. She stood beside the car for a moment and looked at the house before she moved toward it. I stayed on the porch steps and let her come to me. She took in the paint. First the south and front faces, which I had finished 2 weeks earlier. Then the porch, the new cedar steps Earl had built, the railing refastened and level. Her eyes moved the way a professional's eyes move when they are assessing something, rather than simply looking at it. "You painted it," she said. "Labor is free when it's yours." Earl helped. Earl, a neighbor. She came up the steps carefully, the heels finding the edges of each tread. At the top, she turned and looked back at the yard, the fence line cleared and straight. The gravel scattered where I had raked it back from the edges, the garden beds along the south wall weeded and turned. "Where did you get money for materials?" "Paint runs about $12 a gallon. The porch wood came from a cedar that came down on the property line last winter. Earl milled it himself. And the utilities paid from what I had." "Which was what exactly?" I looked at her evenly. "Enough." She tried the question from a different angle, the plumbing, the electrical panel, whether I had had anyone look at the foundation. I told her I had hired a local inspector for a structural check, which was true. It had cost $80 from the envelope money, and the report had confirmed what I had already read in the bones of the house. "Dad." She said it with the particular inflection that signals a pivot. "How are you managing for food day to day?" I reported the non-receipt of my Social Security benefits. "The account you closed returned 4 months of payments to the SSA. I filed for replacement and submitted the bank change form. It's in process." Sandra was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face, not guilt exactly. More the expression of a person who has been handed an accounting they hadn't expected. "Your Social Security," she said. "Yes." The account closure complicated things considerably. My voice was level. I was reporting a fact, not making an accusation. The distinction was intentional. We went inside. I put water on for coffee, and Sandra sat at Eleanor's kitchen table. She set her bag on the chair beside her and folded her hands on the tabletop in the way she did when she was preparing for a structured conversation rather than an ordinary one. I poured 2 cups and set one in front of her. "Dad," she said, "I looked up the county property records online when I found out you'd come here. There's no trust registered under the name Eleanor Calloway. Nothing. How is this property actually titled? You'll need to speak with my lawyer about that." "Which lawyer?" "Mine." The line of her jaw tightened briefly, barely perceptible. She was a real estate attorney. She knew better than most people that an online record search wasn't always complete, especially for older properties in smaller counties. She knew that the thorough answer to a title question required a physical visit to the courthouse, a review of actual recorded documents, not a database query. She had done the database query, found nothing, and concluded the property was unencumbered by anything complicated. She had been wrong, and some part of her was now working out the shape of that error. I could request a parcel search at the recorder's office. "That's entirely your prerogative," I said. I didn't lean toward her. I didn't hold up a hand. "The coffee is going to go cold." She did not take the coffee. She stayed for an hour and a half. I counted the questions afterward, 8 distinct lines of inquiry, each one approaching the same central subject from a different direction. The finances, the condition of the house, my health, whether I had spoken to anyone from the family, whether I needed anything, what my plans were, whether I understood the property's tax situation, that last one delivered with the particular carefulness of someone who believes they are handing you useful information when they are actually probing for something else. Each question received a version of the same answer. The information you are looking for is with my lawyer. I did not say it impatiently. I did not say it coldly. I said it the way you close a valve completely without drama, because the valve is designed to close. When she stood to leave, she did not hug me. She picked up her bag from the chair, said she hoped I was taking care of myself, and walked back through the front door to the rental car. I watched from the porch. She reversed down the driveway without looking back up at the house. I watched the car until it reached the county road and turned toward town. Then I called Earl. She came. How did it go? She searched the property records online before she got here. Found nothing. She hasn't been to the courthouse. A pause on his end. She'll go. Probably. But when she does, she'll find exactly what's already there. Nothing she can reach. I set the phone down on the counter and stood in Eleanor's kitchen for a while. Something she had said was sitting with me. She had searched the records when I arrived, not when she came out to visit. She had been watching from the moment I came here, from hundreds of miles away, through whatever search tools she had access to. What I couldn't answer was what she had been looking for specifically, and what she had expected to find. She had come here for information and left with less than she'd arrived with. That told me something about what she suspected, even if I couldn't yet see the full shape of it. That night, I went to bed, thinking there was still a piece I was missing. I found it 3 weeks later in the lawyer's office. Before I tell you what was inside that sealed envelope, what my mother had recorded and handed to her lawyer over a year before she died, with instructions to give it only to me, I want you to type the word truth in the comments. Just that one word. Because what you're about to hear is the moment the full picture came into focus. Not the vault. Not the collection. This is the moment I understood exactly what had been done and who had known all along. One more note. Some elements of this story are fictionalized for storytelling purposes. If you'd rather not continue, now is the moment to decide. But if you type truth, then you already know you need to hear this. Eleanor's letter had mentioned one more thing in a small note at the bottom of page 7, written in a slightly smaller hand than the rest, as if she had added it after. The lawyer has a sealed file for you. Open it when you're ready. You'll know when that is. I had known when that was in the way she had predicted. It was 3 weeks after Sandra's visit on a Tuesday morning in June, when the drive into town felt like something that needed to happen, rather than something I was choosing to do. The lawyer met me without an appointment, which told me he had been expecting this visit for a while. He went to a cabinet on the far wall, not the one that held the trust documents, a separate one, smaller, with a key he kept on his person rather than in the desk. He brought out a manila envelope sealed with my name written on the front in his handwriting. Your mother brought this in herself approximately 14 months ago, he said, setting it on the desk between us. She had made a recording of a phone conversation she'd had, and she asked me to hold it in a sealed file for you, along with a written summary I prepared at her request, shortly after she delivered it. Her instructions were, give it to Ray when he asks for it. He'll know when that is. I looked at the envelope. She recorded her own phone call. West Virginia is a one-party consent state. Any party to a telephone conversation may legally record it without informing the other participants. Your mother was a participant in the call. What she did was entirely within the law. Bob. I opened the envelope at the table. Inside, a 3-page typed summary, prepared by the lawyer and dated the day after Eleanor had come in. and a small USB drive in a paper sleeve labeled in Eleanor's handwriting, "Recording Original." I read the summary first. Eleanor had called Sandra 14 months ago, approximately 3 months before Eleanor was hospitalized, a year before Dorothy died. The call had lasted 11 minutes. Eleanor had been direct, in the way she was direct about everything. She was not well, she was making her final arrangements, and she needed Sandra to understand something important. She had left her property in Harlan's Creek, including the house and its contents, to Ray through an irrevocable trust. The property was, she said, more significant than its appearance suggested. She needed Sandra to ensure that Ray was informed of the trust and the house after Eleanor was gone. Sandra's responses, according to the summary, were measured and professional. She had asked clarifying questions, the name of the trustee, whether the trust could be challenged. Eleanor had told her it was irrevocable, 46 years, established, and untouchable. Sandra had confirmed she understood. She had said clearly and without hesitation that she would make sure Ray was told. I set the pages down on the desk. The room was quiet for long enough that the lawyer moved slightly in his chair, the small adjustment of someone waiting to see whether a person needs a moment or needs assistance. "She never told me," I said. It wasn't a question. "It's a no," he said. "Based on everything you've described about the family meeting and what followed, she did not." He asked if I wanted to hear the recording. I said yes. He had a small speaker on his desk. He inserted the drive, found the file, and pressed play. Eleanor's voice came into the room. I had not heard it in over a year. Not since the last phone call, a Sunday afternoon, ordinary in every way, during which she had asked how Dorothy was managing, and I had given her the honest answer, and she had listened without offering false comfort, which was the only kind of listening she ever did. I had not expected the recording to affect me the way it did. I had prepared myself, or had thought I had. Her voice was clear, steady. The voice of a woman who had already finished deciding something and was now simply executing it. She spoke to Sandra in the same direct register she had always used with everyone, not unkind, not cold, simply honest and undecorated. She explained the trust. She explained the house. She used the words, "more significant than its appearance," in the same way she had written them in the letter. And hearing her say them aloud after reading them on the page made the connection between the letter and this room feel very close. And Sandra's voice that I had not been prepared for. Professional. Precise. She asked the right questions. She said the right things. At the end of the call, when Eleanor asked if she understood what was needed, Sandra said yes, she understood, and she would make sure Ray knew. The recording ended. The speaker made a small click. "My mother called her," I said after a while. "Trusted her with this." And Sandra took that information, knowing the trust existed, knowing the house was significant, and did nothing with it. She assumed without investigating, left it to me as a liability she didn't want to deal with, and moved on. She trusted her own quick assessment over the word of a dying woman who had specifically asked her for one thing. The lawyer said nothing. There was nothing useful to add to that, and he knew it. The recording," I said, "in terms of what it demonstrates. It establishes that your daughter was directly informed of the trust and of the property by the deceased prior to any of the events you've described. It reflects her explicit agreement to pass that information to you. The fact that she did not is relevant to a question of intent, what she knew and when she knew it, and what she chose to do with that knowledge. I may need a copy. Your mother anticipated that." He reached into the same cabinet and produced a second sealed envelope, smaller, already labeled with my name. "She left a duplicate with instructions to give it to you if you requested it." She was a careful woman. I took both envelopes and drove home with them on the passenger seat. I had expected anger. I found something else instead, something colder and more functional. The particular sensation I used to get in engineering when I had finally located the exact stress fracture in a failing component. Not shock, not grief, diagnosis. The failure point was identified, documented, and now in my possession. From 30 years of working with things that broke, I knew what you did next. You built around the fracture until it could not damage anything that mattered anymore. You didn't rage at it. You engineered a solution. That was what I was going to do. In the 3 weeks after leaving the lawyer's office, I worked. I cleared the fence line on the north side of the property post by post, cutting back the growth that had overtaken it over the past several years. I rehung the back gate on new hardware. I ordered a second-hand dehumidifier from a shop in Charleston and installed it in the vault as a backup unit because the original equipment was running. But a system you depend on is a system worth protecting twice. I was building something, and I intended to keep building it. The vehicle that came up the driveway on a Tuesday morning in July was not Earl's truck and not a car I recognized. A man got out carrying a clipboard and an envelope. He asked my name, confirmed it, and handed me the envelope. I signed for it. He got back in his vehicle and drove away. I opened it on the porch. Petition for appointment of conservator for the person and estate of Raymond Thomas Calloway. I read it through once, standing up. Then I folded it along its original creases, set it on the porch railing, and looked out at the yard, the fence line, the oak, the garden beds. I was not frightened. I was not wounded by it. I had been moving toward this for 3 weeks without knowing its exact shape, and now I knew its shape. I called Earl. She filed. On what grounds? She age, isolated relocation, unexplained financial activity, suspected exploitation by a third party. A pause. Any medical evidence attached, not a page. I went back to the petition before I called the lawyer. I read it a second time more slowly as a document rather than as a provocation. On page 3, there were 2 signatures from the petitioners. Sandra's was first sharp, compressed, the kind of signature that hasn't changed since law school. Mitchell's was second, at the bottom of the page. Mitchell's signature looked different from the one I had seen on documents over the years. He had pressed the pen into the paper more firmly than was necessary. The way you press when something in your hand doesn't feel entirely right, but you're committing to it anyway. The letters were slightly larger than I would have expected, slightly less controlled. I noticed it in the way an engineer notices something that doesn't match the specification, not with alarm, but with registration. I filed it in the part of my mind that stores things to be understood later. The lawyer met me that afternoon. He read through the petition with the focused quiet of a man who has seen a great many petitions and is calibrating this one against the full range of what he has encountered. "Mater, these are the thinnest grounds I have seen in 15 years of practice," he said when he finished. "Then why file?" He set the papers down. "Because filing initiates a process. She doesn't require medical evidence to submit the petition, she requires it to prevail. Her strategy, I believe, is to use the filing itself to compel the court to order an independent evaluation of your cognitive and financial capacity. If the court appoints an examiner of its own choosing, that examiner will come to you without any preparation on your part under court authority on a timeline you don't control." He paused. "Shadem. She is hoping an independent assessment will find something that she can't currently produce on her own." I understood the mechanism immediately. It was simple enough once you saw it. Sandra couldn't get a medical assessment without asking me to cooperate, which I would decline. But a court could order one. The petition was not the weapon, it was the trigger for the weapon she couldn't access directly. The counter was equally simple. Remove the trigger before she could pull it. If I provide my own assessment first, I said obtained voluntarily and on the record before any court order is issued. Then when she arrives at a hearing with no medical evidence, you arrive with documentation. The examiner she hoped the court would appoint becomes unnecessary. He nodded. It also demonstrates a degree of proactive transparency that courts tend to view favorably. I drove to Charleston 2 days later. The physician was a general practitioner in his mid-50s, recommended by the lawyer with no prior connection to anyone involved in my situation. He conducted a full cognitive assessment over the course of 2 hours. The MOCA, which evaluates memory, language, attention, and executive function across a standardized sequence. Supplementary testing for processing speed and information retention. A review of current medications and general health markers. I approached it the way I approached any technical evaluation, methodically, without anxiety about the outcome, focused on accuracy. You don't improve a test result by wanting it. You provide the most honest inputs available, and you let the instrument do its work. The results came back within the week. The physician's letter was specific and unqualified, all scores within normal range for a 68-year-old adult in good general health. No markers of concern, no recommendations for further evaluation. I put the letter in the folder. In August, the SSA replacement payments arrived. 4 months of Social Security benefits returned through the agency's non-receipt process exactly as the agent had told me they would in April. I recorded the deposit date in my notebook and added the bank statement confirmation to the folder. Every transaction, every decision, every piece of paper that touched this situation now had a home in that folder in chronological order. By September, the folder had become what I privately called the banker's box, an expanding accordion file with labeled sections for medical records, legal documents, financial statements, property records, and correspondence. The kind of organized record that took 30 years of engineering habit to build automatically, and that I now understood I would need to walk into a courtroom with. The hearing date was set for February 14th. I wrote it in the notebook. 44 years of Valentine's Day dinners with Dorothy, and now this. I closed the notebook and opened to the next page and began the list of what remained to be done before February. It wasn't a long list, but it had to be complete. From August to the new year, I did 3 things: finished restoring the house, sold the second portion of the collection, and built what I had come to think of as the case for myself. Each required the same discipline, only applied differently. The second sale took place in September and October. Garfield handled it the same way he had handled the first, methodically, with the kind of patience that serious work in that field requires. 150 pieces selected for this round, based on his assessment of current private market conditions. 3 separate buyers, each one operating under a non-disclosure agreement before any item changed hands. The total across both transactions came to $750,000. I allocated it the way an engineer allocates resources when the structural requirements are known and the margins need to be protected. $45,000 into a maintenance reserve for the vault and property. The climate system would eventually need service. The house would have ongoing needs. $80,000 set aside as liquid funds for operating expenses. $25,000 as a retainer for the lawyer, which he accepted without comment, and which I considered a reasonable investment in what was coming. The remainder went into a savings account I had no specific plans for yet. My daily life didn't change. I still made coffee before dawn and drank it on the porch. I still cooked from the same basic pantry Eleanor had kept: beans, rice. Whatever produce came from the garden beds I had cleared and planted in May. Earl came by on Saturdays, and we worked on whatever the house needed that week. The money was there if I needed it. I didn't need much of it. By Christmas, the house was done. Not renovated in the sense of being altered, done in the sense that every system was functioning correctly, and every surface was in a condition that didn't require apology. The roof had been inspected and resealed along the north face where the flashing had lifted. The plumbing had been flushed and pressure tested throughout. The upper window that had been open to weather since before I arrived now had a new sash and glass. The kitchen electrical panel had been brought up to current standards by a licensed electrician from town who had taken the work seriously and charged an honest price. The last thing I did was install a deadbolt on the front door. Earl was there when I finished. He looked at the lock the way Earl looked at most things, taking the measure of it before he said anything. "Your mother never locked this door." "I know, But she also never had a conservatorship petition filed against her. He came very close to smiling. It was the nearest I had seen him get. The folder I had started in the spring had expanded through the fall into the accordion file I now thought of as the banker's box borrowed terminology from engineering project management, where you keep every document related to a build in one organized, retrievable system. The sections were labeled and in order. Medical. The full cognitive assessment results from Charleston. The physician's written evaluation, a follow-up appointment note from January that I had driven down specifically to generate. Not because I expected my status to have changed, but because having a recent date on the medical record was more useful than having only the results from 6 months prior. Legal, the trust documents from the lawyer's office. The county recorder's confirmation of the trust registration, a copy of the deed, and the sealed envelope containing the USB recording and its duplicate labeled, dated and initialed by the lawyer as authenticated evidence. Financial complete bank statements from my first deposit in April through the present, with a handwritten note on each page identifying every transaction and its source or purpose. Tax receipts, the vehicle title. Invoices from every contractor who had worked on the house with dates and payment confirmations. The SSA correspondence documenting the non-receipt claim, the processing timeline, and the replacement payment deposit. Timeline, a single page. My own handwriting listing every significant decision I had made since arriving in Harlan's Creek with dates, amounts where applicable, and the rationale. The kind of document that answers in advance every question a person might ask about whether a 68-year-old man living alone on a county road in West Virginia had been making coherent decisions or had needed someone to make them for him. Earl sat at the kitchen table on several evenings in November and December and helped me organize. He didn't do it because I required the assistance. I had the system in my head and could have built it alone. He did it because he wanted to be present for it, and I understood that without either of us saying it. The evening of February 13th, Earl came by without being asked. We sat on the cedar porch in cold that had the specific quality of February in the mountains, not bitter, just settled and final, and drank coffee without talking much. After a while, he asked if I was ready. I built turbines for 30 years, I said. Before you test a turbine, you already know whether it's going to hold if the tolerances are correct throughout. You know it from the documentation, from the calculations, from the condition of each component going in. The test doesn't tell you something you didn't already know. It confirms what the preparation established. I set down the cup. The tolerances are correct. Earl nodded once. I went inside, closed the banker's box, and set it by the front door. Then I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard, the oak, the fence Earl had helped me level, the garden beds ready for spring. I went to bed knowing what the morning was. The Harlan's Creek Courthouse is a 2-story brick building at the corner of Main and 2nd Street. I had driven past it several times since November on the way to the library, on the way to the assessor's office. I had never gone inside. The parking lot was half full by 8:15 in the morning. I found a space near the back, set the banker's box on the passenger seat, where I could reach it, and sat for a moment, looking at the building's front entrance. Then I picked up the box and went in. The courtroom assigned to our case was on the 2nd floor, smaller than I had expected, paneled in oak that needed refinishing, lit by fluorescent fixtures that gave the room a particular institutional pallor. 3 rows of public seating at the back, empty except for 2 people I didn't recognize. A clerk's table to the left of the bench. A court reporter with a machine. Sandra was already seated at the petitioner's table on the left, beside a man in his early 40s, wearing a dark suit. Her colleague from the firm in Cleveland, I assumed. Someone accustomed to courtrooms and carrying himself the way people do when their confidence has been professionally calibrated over many years. Sandra was composed in the way she was always composed. Posture, correct folder, open pen parallel to the edge of the table. Mitchell sat beside her. When I came through the door, he looked up. Then he looked down at the table surface in front of him, and he kept looking there. I sat at the respondent's table on the right with my lawyer and set the banker's box on the table between us. My lawyer placed his own folder beside it and aligned his notepad without ceremony. We had gone over everything the week before. There was nothing left to discuss this morning. The judge entered at 8:30 exactly. He was in his early 60s. With reading glasses he wore low on his nose, and the particular economy of movement that belongs to someone who has presided over enough proceedings to have stopped performing any part of the function. He sat, arranged his papers, and read the petition in the silence of the room. After several minutes, he looked up first at Sandra's lawyer, then at mine. "Counselor," he said to Sandra's lawyer, "you've filed a petition for conservatorship of person and estate on grounds of incapacity. What clinical evidence do you intend to present?" Sandra's lawyer rose. He was practiced and unhurried. He laid out the argument Sandra had built over the preceding months: the respondent's age, the decision to relocate abruptly following bereavement, financial activity that had not been accounted for or explained to the family, the possibility of exploitation by an unidentified third party. He said the word exploitation with the particular deliberateness of someone who has found in experience that the word tends to do useful work in a room. He concluded with something about the genuine concern of an attentive family. The judge looked at him over the reading glasses. "Counsel, genuine family concern is not clinical evidence. It is not a legal standard for incapacity under West Virginia Code. Do you have a medical assessment, an expert witness, a clinical opinion of any kind?" We anticipated the court would order an independent evaluation. I see. The judge wrote something. "We'll hear from the respondent." My lawyer opened the banker's box. He presented each item in sequence, setting the documents on the table the way you build an argument, not dramatically, but completely. The physician's letter from Charleston, the full scored results of the cognitive assessment administered in July, and the follow-up note from January. The trust documentation from the county recorder authenticated. The complete bank statements, every transaction notated and explained in the respondent's own handwriting from the first deposit forward. The property tax receipt, the vehicle title, the SSA correspondence, and the confirmation of the replacement payment deposit. The contractor invoices, the single-page decision timeline. The judge reviewed each item as it was presented. He did not rush. At one point, he asked my lawyer a clarifying question about the trust registration date, received the answer, and wrote it down. "One final item, Your Honor." My lawyer placed a small evidence envelope on the table. Inside was the USB drive. An audio recording of a telephone conversation between the respondent's late mother, Eleanor Calloway, and the primary petitioner, Sandra Calloway, made 14 months ago. The recording was made by Eleanor Calloway on her own device on her own telephone line. As a party to the conversation, fully compliant with West Virginia's one-party consent statute. It was subsequently delivered by Mrs. Calloway to her attorney for the explicit purpose of documentation and has been held in authenticated sealed storage since that date. The judge admitted it. The court reporter noted it. My lawyer connected a small speaker to the evidence laptop on our table, located the file, and pressed play. Eleanor's voice came into the courtroom. I did not look at Sandra. I watched the judge. I watched his face as my mother explained in the direct and undecorated way. She explained everything: that she was not well, that she had made her arrangements, that she had left her property in Harlan's Creek to her son through an irrevocable trust, and that the property was more significant than its outward appearance indicated. I watched his face as she asked Sandra to ensure that Ray was told, and as Sandra's voice, professional and precise, confirmed that she understood and would make certain he knew. The recording ended. The room was still for several seconds. Sandra's lawyer began to speak. Your Honor, regarding the source of the respondent's financial, it has been documented in full, the judge said. The trust was established and is irrevocable. That matter is not in dispute. He set down his pen and looked directly at Sandra. Not at her lawyer. At Sandra, Ms. Calloway. This petition contains no clinical evidence of any kind. The respondent has provided a complete cognitive assessment from a qualified physician, a comprehensive financial record with documentation for every transaction since his arrival in Harlan's Creek, and authenticated property records establishing the legal basis for his residence and resources. By every standard this court applies, he is fully competent. He paused and looked at the recording note in the file. I will also note for the record that the communication entered into evidence demonstrates that the petitioner was directly informed of the respondent's assets and their significance more than 1 year ago, and did not convey that information to him. I will leave the implications of that to the respondent and his counsel to consider at their discretion. The petition is dismissed. Costs are assessed to the petitioner. The gavel came down. I did not feel what I had expected to feel. Sandra intercepted me in the hallway outside the courtroom doors. She said my name. I stopped and turned. "What's in that house, Dad?" "Your grandmother spent her life protecting something she understood to have value. She succeeded." I picked up the box. "How much?" "Enough that I don't require a conservator." I held her gaze without difficulty. "Sandra, if you want to come to Harlan's Creek as my daughter, not as someone taking inventory, the door is open. If you can figure out what the difference feels like, you know where I live." I turned and walked the hall toward the exit. Mitchell was standing alone near the stairwell several feet from where Sandra had been. He was not with his lawyer, not on his phone, just standing in the fluorescent light of the hallway with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching me come toward him. As I reached him, he opened his mouth. The words didn't come. He closed it again, and something moved across his face that I recognized. Not guilt, exactly, but the thing that sits specifically beneath guilt when a person has understood something they cannot unsay. I gave him one nod, short, deliberate, and walked past and out into the February air. I sat in the truck for a few minutes before I started it. Not because I was shaken. A tension that had been drawn tight for a very long time had released, and the body needs a moment to register the difference between what it was holding and what it is holding now. I drove home the long way through the valley, past fields that still held the last of winter at the edges. By the time I turned onto County Road 7, I knew what I needed to do next. 1 week after the hearing, I drove past an empty storefront on 2nd Street, a former pharmacy that had been closed long enough that no one in Harlan's Creek seemed to remember exactly when it had shut. The paper signs were still taped to the inside of the window. It was a good-sized space, single-story, with a door that opened directly to the sidewalk. I kept driving, but I came back to it in my mind several times over the next 2 days in the particular way that an idea returns when it isn't finished with you yet. The idea didn't come from anything abstract. It came from a conversation at Patterson's Hardware 4 days after the hearing. A man named Leonard, 73 years old, broad through the chest in the way of someone who had worked with his hands for most of his life, was buying caulk when I came in for a drill bit. We found ourselves at the register at the same time. He recognized me from the courthouse. He said he'd heard things went well. I said they had. Then he said his daughter had sold his house while he was in the hospital for a hip replacement. He'd been living in the back room of a friend's place for 4 months. He didn't know how to fight it, or whether fighting it was even possible. He said it the way people say things they have turned over too many times to be shocked by anymore. I told him I knew exactly how to address it. Come by tomorrow. I leased the storefront the following week, a month-to-month arrangement, reasonable rate, the landlord glad to have it occupied. I bought 2 tables, 6 chairs, a coffee maker, and a whiteboard. I did not file for nonprofit status with the IRS. I did not apply for grants. I opened a private resource office the same way a retired physician might keep a consulting room. No formal practice. No institutional overhead, just a space where people who needed information could come and find someone who knew where to look. The lawyer from down the street came by on Tuesday afternoons, under a personal consulting arrangement. Earl came Tuesday and Thursday mornings. I made the coffee and asked questions and listened to the answers, and what I provided was not legal counsel or housing services, it was information referrals, and the experience of someone who had recently gone through the same machinery and come out the other side with the documentation to prove it. A woman from the West Virginia State University Extension Office came in one Friday and helped Earl and me set up a simple intake system, nothing bureaucratic, just a process for connecting people to the right resources without losing track of where each case stood. The sign went up in April. Hand-painted, modest Callaway Community Resource Office. There was no ribbon cutting, no announcement in the county paper. Just a door that was open on certain days, with the hours written in marker on an index card taped to the glass. Word traveled the way it always does in a small town, through the hardware store, through the church parking lots, through the particular informal networks of people who watch out for one another. The first week, 3 people. The month after that, 15. Older adults whose property had been mishandled. Widows tangled in probate they hadn't been prepared for. Men and women who had lost benefits they were still owed. People who came in not knowing what they needed, only that something had gone wrong and left knowing what to do next. In June, Earl and I were sitting at the small table after the last visitor had gone. The afternoon was quiet around us in the way that spaces go quiet when the work inside them is done for the day. "Do you ever think about how different this year looks from where you started?" he asked. I thought about it. I came here with $52 and a compass I didn't understand. My mother spent 60 years building something she kept completely private. I spent 30 years thinking she was a quiet woman who liked to garden. Earl waited. It turns out quiet wasn't the right word. Deliberate was the right word. Careful on purpose, over a very long time. Earl looked out the window at the street. She raised a good one. She did what she could with the materials available, I said. Earl almost smiled. I almost did too. In September, on a late afternoon on the cedar porch, my phone rang. Mitchell's name on the screen. I answered. Mitchell. His voice had the particular tension of a man who has rehearsed something and is still deciding at the moment of delivery whether to follow the script. Dad. He used the word deliberately. I want to apologize. I went along with Sandra's plan. I told myself it was practical. I knew it wasn't the truth when I said it. I think I knew from the start. I looked at the oak tree. The leaves had been turning for 2 weeks. The deep amber orange of the old growth, the hillsides behind it, a slow wash of color. I let him finish before I said anything. The door is always open, Mitchell, when you're ready to come through it as my son, not as someone taking inventory, not with an agenda, just as my son, it will be open. That's the only thing I have to offer you. But it's a real offer. A pause on his end. Okay, Dad. All right. I set the phone on the porch railing. The line of hills to the east was losing light from the top, down the ridgelines going darker, while the trees below still held color. Sandra never called. I had not expected her to, and I had made my peace with that expectation in the same way I had made my peace with most things over the past year, not by resolving it, but by ceasing to require it to be different from what it was. The autumn settled around Harlan's Creek, the way it always had, with a particular clarity of air that belonged only to the mountains at this time of year. I sat on the cedar porch Earl had built and held the second cup of afternoon coffee and watched the light move across the yard. The oak was full in its fall color. The fence line was straight and held. The banker's box was inside the house, filed and done with. The collection was still mostly in the vault below. The plan Garfield had outlined would take years, which was fine. Years were something I had. I took the compass from my jacket pocket and held it flat on my palm. The needle pointed where it always pointed. Toward the oak, toward the ground beneath it, toward the place where Eleanor had put the last piece, and waited for me to find it. I didn't need to follow it anymore. I knew what was there. My mother spent 60 years keeping the most important thing she had built entirely out of sight. Not because she was secretive, because she was careful about what the world could take from you when it knew what you had. She understood something I am still in the process of learning. The things you build in quiet are the things that last. I stopped counting what Sandra had taken. I know what I arrived here with $52 a compass I didn't understand and a guilt I hadn't earned. I know what I have now. Those two facts connect in a way I could not have explained last March. I can explain it now. My mother gave me a key I didn't know I was carrying. I found what it opened. The rest, the people who come through the door on Tuesdays, Earl on the porch, the light on that oak in October. The rest I built myself. I was home. I've told you Raymond Calloway's story, one of the grandpa stories I carry closest, about loss, quiet betrayal, and a mother who planned in silence for 60 years. A family story I never expected to live, let alone tell. Here is what I want you to take from it. Read what you sign. Every page, every line. Not because your family will betray you, but because love doesn't exempt a document from its consequences. I was an engineer who stopped reading because I was grieving. That was my mistake. Don't be like me in that moment. The lesson that came harder, my mother trusted God not to shield her from difficulty, but to place the right person in the right place at the right time. Earl at a hardware counter, a compass in a drawer, a letter drafted 4 times. I don't believe that was coincidence. My personal view, the people who strip you of your dignity are counting on your exhaustion. Don't give it to them. Document everything. Be thorough. Outlast them. Grandpa stories like this one and every family story worth telling don't just entertain, they prepare you. Because someday you may be the one standing at a kitchen table, pen in hand, too broken to read page 3. Have you or someone you love lived a family story like this? Leave it in the comments. These grandpa stories only grow when people share theirs. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs it today, and let's keep building this together. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. That means everything. One final note. Some upcoming stories contain fictional elements crafted for educational purposes. If that's not the content for you, no judgment, step away and find what fits. But if you're still here, the next one is already worth your time.